Good evening, everybody. My name is Jonathan Elkind. I'm a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And thank you for joining us this evening, both in person and on the webcast for this program. Last June, when President Trump announced the intention to have the United States withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, many people wondered what the new administration's policies meant for efforts to protect the global climate, both human and natural systems, from the worst impacts of human-caused climate change. At the Center on Global Energy Policy, we felt that this question was both important and complex. On the one hand, we saw encouraging signs, such as the concerted effort to maintain momentum from Paris. For example, the We Are Still In collaboration of states, cities, and corporations. We also saw continued evolution of markets in the direction of low-carbon energy systems, falling prices for clean energy technologies, and a new awareness that clean energy is good for business and for job creation. On the other hand, we saw risks of a loss of momentum, especially if countries like the United States shifted from a proactive posture to one of reluctance or even hostility toward international collaboration and multilateral solutions. Our center therefore created a speaker series called Where Next on Climate, and tonight's program is one of the segments in this series. The program that we're going to focus on tonight is fundamentally about the interplay between development objectives and environmental protection. This is a debate that has a very long and at times difficult history. In the period leading up to the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992, many national leaders and everyday citizens around the globe viewed the two objectives as being counterposed. Greater attention to development, it was thought, would lead inexorably to greater pollution, including climate pollution. The rebuttal was that greater attention to climate and other aspects of environmental quality would have the predictable effect of leaving in poverty those who needed more energy services in order to have a better quality of life, more education, and opportunity, and higher incomes. Since that time, with the advent of the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, there has been a concerted effort to try to find ways to integrate climate and development issues. And so tonight we will be having a discussion with three experts in these related fields exactly on this point of intersection between and among development, energy access, and climate. We will have an introductory presentation first by Philippe Benoit, followed by a panel discussion involving Ellen Morris on the far side from where I am, and Kathleen Auth. Let me first quickly say that this event, like all of those at the Center on Global Energy Policy, is being webcast live, and both the full video and a podcast recording will be available on our website and iTunes in the coming days. And for those of you who are watching online using the webcast, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question for the panelists at any time using the hashtag CGEP events. That's like Center on Global Energy Policy, and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. Let me take just a minute and introduce our speakers. Philippe Benoit is Managing Director at Global Infrastructure Advisory Services 2050, specializing in international energy, finance, development, and sustainability issues. He's also a Senior Associate in the Energy and National Security Program at the Center on Strategic and International Studies. Philip's career has been spent in the junction point, if I can use that term again, of energy, development, and finance. He worked most recently before this at the International Energy Agency, where he headed the Energy, Environment, and Energy Efficiency divisions. Before that, he had a long career at the World Bank and also previously work in investment banking. Ellen Morris teaches energy and enterprise development courses at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, who are the hosts this evening. In addition to her faculty appointment, Dr. Morris is the president and founder of Sustainable Energy Solutions, a professional services company that promotes the development, the deployment of clean energy technologies and services as a means to support economic development and reduce poverty in developing countries. Dr. Morris holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Geophysical Engineering from the Colorado School of Mines and a doctoral degree in Marine Geophysics from the University of Rhode Island. And I neglected to mention that, Philip's educational background is a law degree from a certain other Ivy League school that begins with an H, and a bachelor's in economics and political science from Yale University. Last but not least, Kathleen Auth is the Acting Energy Office Director for Power Africa, which, as many of you will know, is a U.S. government-led initiative that aims to double access to reliable and affordable energy services in sub-Saharan Africa. In this role, she works across the U.S. government and with Power Africa's 140 public and private partners to facilitate increased investment in African power sectors, expand access to both on- and off-grid power solutions, and strengthen national power utilities and other key institutions. She holds a Master's of Science in Natural Resource Management from the University, and you're going to have to help me here, of Akureyri in Iceland. Should have checked that one out first, eh? And a bachelor's from Bowdoin College. So with that, I'd like to ask Philippe Benoit to please take the podium and take us through his presentation. After the panel discussion that we will have following the slide presentation, we will also be calling on you in the audience, both those here in the room and those watching on webcast, for a question and answer series as well. So as my colleagues speak, please start thinking about your questions. Philip, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks a lot, John, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to do in my presentation is focus in on a couple of energy for development issues and discuss how they relate to the issue of climate change. And specifically, as you can see from the title, the issue of providing access, the issue of development in developing countries, and basically at what point do we sort of see tensions with the issue of climate change. My presentation will last 30 minutes, not more, because if it goes over 30 minutes, I owe John a dinner, so I will stay under 30 minutes. But having said that, I think you'll find that probably looking at me for 30 minutes will be a little boring, so I have a variety of slides. Don't spend too much time looking at the slides. They're really put up there for graphical reasons to just illustrate points that I want to make. So the first thing that I think it's important to recognize is the relationship between energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And what you have here are greenhouse gas emissions increasing over time. You'll see a variety of slides. They tend to resemble each other. They tend to have always on the x-axis number of years, and then on the y-axis either the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, the demand for energy, or GDP. And what you basically see is that over time, greenhouse gas emissions have increased, and with them, energy emissions have increased. And most importantly, energy emissions generate about 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. So, energy sector is a big part of the issue when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of those energy emissions are actually driven by the amount of energy that we consume. So, for example, what you see is an increase in global energy demand since 1990, and that has been tracked very much by a similar increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And when we look ahead and we try to figure out how can we avoid a situation where we have a 6-degree centigrade increase in global temperature and really end up in a situation where we're at 2 degrees or below, the IEA and other organizations have done a variety of mapping. And basically, what we see is in order to remain at 2 degrees or less, we basically have to cut energy emissions by about 40% by 2040 and about 50%. And so you see these different lines. And what's interesting to see is that when we compare that to what happens on the energy demand, we see a corresponding type of story. Basically, if we want to, under IEA and other modeling, get to a world where basically greenhouse gas emissions are peak by 2020 and reduce to the levels needed to limit global temperature increase to 2 degrees or less, we need to follow an emissions path, a demand pathway in terms of energy, where energy demand is about 30 to 40% less than it would otherwise be in a business as usual case. So the important point here is to recognize that energy demand will drive energy emissions will drive temperature increase. And the fact that energy demand drives climate change has fundamentally altered the way in which we look at energy for development. When I started at the World Bank in 1990, the objective was to get as much energy as possible to developing countries. There fundamentally was an environmental and social constraints, but there was no appreciation that there was a climate constraint. And what we see now is that basically so much of our fossil fuels tend to be embedded in our energy demand that as a practical matter, in order to decarbonize, not only do we need to promote renewables, we need to address the issue of energy demand. And that's one reason I want to talk about the access issue and the interplay of access and the climate constraint. Now, as John's piece described in the introduction, and the note that was sent around, there is a narrative out there that basically there's a lot of tension between providing access to people and climate change. Why? Because if you provide access to people, you're giving them energy, they're going to consume more energy, there are going to be a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's going to drive up climate constraint. Now, when we look at what's happening in terms of access, there are about 1.1 billion people today without access to electricity. And there are about 2.8 billion people without access to clean cooking facilities. This is the access agenda. This is the access objective that is incorporated into the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, adopted a couple of years ago by the UN. The idea is to reduce these numbers to 0. And if I could just point out one thing to you, China used to have a figure when it came to people without access to electricity. They've been successful at achieving virtually universal access. And so the IEA and other organizations try to assess what is the impact of giving access to all these people. And in a recent study issued a few months ago by the IEA, giving access to 2.3 billion people in terms of clean cooking and electricity was evaluated to have the following types of impacts. It would increase energy demand by 37 million tons of oil equivalent. That's 0.3%, barely any impact. And the other thing is it only required about 119 terawatt hours of production. I want you to bear that number in mind, because I'm going to come back to it. CO2 emissions, 70 million tons, 0.2% of total global emissions, a de minimis impact. In fact, the IEA estimated that the overall impact on greenhouse gas emissions would be positive because basically of the substitution of biomass and other issues in terms of cleaning up clean cooking. But as you see from those spinning things, what's important to understand is that this IEA analysis was providing energy access as compared to their baseline case. So there was a delta here. It wasn't a question of providing energy access to the entire 1.1 billion people. In fact, if we look at other IEA analysis that was done 5 years ago, we get a better sense as to maybe what that would entail. 1.1 billion people. In 2011, it was estimated they would require 840 terawatt hours. And I want to focus your eyes on the column in red and blue. That would generate about 0.2 gigatons, which represents less than 1% of the 32 gigatons of production. Compare that to in the US. Let's say these people consumed the way we consume in the United States. There are 300 million people. We require 4,200 terawatt hours. If we were 1.1 billion people, that would be 7.3 gigatons. That would be a 23% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Europeans tend to consume less, 2.8 gigatons for 1.1 billion, 7% increase. China consumes more, actually. That would be a 10% increase. If these 1.1 billion people consumed the way India consumes, we'd be looking at a 2% increase. And if they consume the way sub-Saharan Africa consumes, we'd be looking at less than 1%. So one important point here, of course, is how these people actually consume electricity, how much they consume when they get access, will drive, to a large extent, what is the nature of the challenge that we have. But you see all these figures are much higher than the figure from the IA perspective. So let's drill down a little more into this issue. What, in fact, would be the impact of providing access to everybody? Now, one thing to bear in mind is there are a variety of upward pressures, in the sense that there are 1.1 billion people without access to electricity today. But if you project out to 2030 and you did nothing, more and more people would be born into those families. And you'd probably end up with something closer to 1.5 billion people. So then when we're thinking about providing universal access, we have to think about providing universal access to probably somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 billion people. But having said that, there are a variety of downward dynamics that would tend to reduce the amount of emissions. The first is to understand that when we go from access to actual energy consumption, the families we're dealing with are poor, mostly rural populations. They don't consume much. If you give them electricity, they don't have a lot of opportunities to consume much. The other thing is when we think about the relationship between how much they consume and CO2 emissions, there are a variety of other factors that would tend to reduce the impact. As I noted, a lot of these rural populations, a lot of these families are rural populations, many are remote households, and given that, it often makes sense to favor off-grid solutions, small mini-grids and household systems, and the fact of the matter is it often makes sense to supply that electricity through renewable systems. If I could give you an illustration of an issue I faced when I was working on the Republic of Congo, a variety of small towns had diesel systems. They had a major problem in terms of refueling those diesel systems, getting diesels to these extremely remote small towns. If they had had renewable systems, they wouldn't be facing that refueling problem. So renewables make a lot of sense for the demographics that we're talking about. And in fact, a lot of donors tend to like to fund renewables. So that when we look at these various factors, what we see is that there's going to likely be a very high percentage of renewables that are going to be mobilized to provide this access, and that is going to further delink access from emissions. So when we look at these various numbers, whether it's 0.2%, whether it's 1% or the like, I think the bottom line where I tend to come out on this is that if we talk about providing access, it would only increase very minimally global demand, about 1%, and its impact on greenhouse gas emissions would be even less, 0.5%, or even potentially positive because of the clean cooking stove issue. So that's the access story. I'm pretty much done with the presentation because I think the fundamental point here is that access is not likely to have a significant impact. Arguably, it's going to have a de minimis impact on the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. The issue, the problem, where the rubber meets the road, though that's actually misusing that, that metaphor, but really lies somewhere else. And I think in that regard, it's important to take a step back and talk about what has been going on in terms of energy use by developing countries. How has energy really been used for development? Now, in the past, there was a lot of focus on extractive industries. There was this notion out there that basically developing countries had a lot of natural resources, and what they would do is they would sell it to OECD countries that would convert it, use it, do a lot of manufacturing, turn around, send money back into these developing countries. And the fundamental question was, what was the governance structure in these developing countries? How were they going to use the money? Would they use it wisely? So there were initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and the like. A lot of focus on these issues in the 1990s into the 2000s. And while all of this discussion was taking place about transparency around extractive industries and the like, China was very quietly moving up. And what we see is that basically, if you look at this graph, the yellow line is GDP, and all the wedges are energy consumption. From 1990 to 2000 to 2004, all the way to 2012 and beyond, China's GDP was increasing exponentially. Its energy use was increasing exponentially. And the important point, as you know, China is not an exporter of energy. China uses domestic resources and, if anything, is an importer of energy. So as opposed to what was the traditional view of energy for development, where basically you take the resources out of the ground in a developing country, send it to the developed country, they send you money back, that's not what was happening in China. China was using the energy for domestic purposes. And this is what was driving the massive explosion of China's development. And what we see happened in China was happening in other places as well. In India, dotted line GDP, the bars are energy demand, domestic consumption. India tends to import a lot of energy. Same thing in Brazil. And I could put up a whole slew of slides that all show the same story. Increasing domestic energy demand accompanying significant increases in development. And so we see this shift in the story. I'll be frank, I was at the World Bank from 1990 into 2000, and after that, we weren't really paying that close attention to this shift. I think in many ways it surprised everybody. All of a sudden, everybody woke up to a world in which China had largely started to develop, and it had done it using energy for its own purposes, for domestic consumption. And that is what has been driving Chinese economic development, and the rest of the developing world has looked to China and said, me too, that's what we need to do. And the fact of the matter is, when we look ahead, we can anticipate even more energy demand. So what you have here is projections from the IA in terms of what's going to happen in terms of GDP growth, which is in green, and energy demand, which is in blue. And when you look at India, even more striking. You see the red line increasing dramatically as GDP skyrockets as well. In fact, when we look across the developing countries, what we see are significant increases, projected increases in energy demand, with actually India having the largest increase. And the other thing is, if you look at China, you actually see a significant increase. A lot of this has to do with your graphs. On my other graph, it looked maybe like they were plateauing. But the fact of the matter is, China is projected to have the second largest increase in energy demand through 2040 under IA estimates. And if we compare that to what's happening in OECD countries, we're actually seeing a decrease.
Oh, I see. It's this one.
So that when we look forward, basically, OECD countries, we see a peak and actually a projected decrease in total energy demand. And again, remembering that energy demand is closely correlated with emissions. At the same time, in developing countries, what we see is a projected significant increase in energy demand. All of the projected increase in the demand for energy at a global level will take place outside of the OECD countries, will take place in developing countries. So what is one of the things that has been driving this and is likely to drive it further? It's something I like to refer to as the emergent consumer class, which is basically, it's the billions of people in the middle class. It's the hundreds of millions of people who are richer than the middle class, as well as the people who are wedged in some ways between the extreme poor and the middle class, the aspirants who aspire to middle class status. These are what we can call the emerging consumer class. And what I don't include in here are the poor, the 1.1 billion. And that's reflected in the fact of what we saw from the previous analysis. Poor people will not be consuming a lot. The rest of society will be consuming a lot. And the numbers we're talking about are extremely large. There are about 2 billion of these emerging consumer class members in 1990. There are about 4 billion today, and they're projected to grow to 6 billion in 2030, 5 times the population of developed countries. And at the same time, there's a projection that developing country energy demand will grow by about 4,000 million tons of oil equivalent by 2040, a 50% increase compared to where they are today. And again, if we put this back in the context of the access discussion, access will require, a gross estimate, 200 million tons of oil equivalent to give 1.1 billion people. So it's not the 1.1 billion people who are poor who are driving this increase in demand. It's the emergent consumer class. And basically, they're going to be responsible for most of it. Why? Because They have more demand for transport, from minibuses to commuter trains to personal cars. But it also includes, I want to emphasize, commuter trains. We're not just talking about the middle class. We're talking about people who also in India have to get on the train to go to work and the like. People want new homes, apartments, cars, petrochemicals to make the products that we all use, appliances, air conditioners. In fact, if we look at China under this classification, their emergent consumer class grew from less than 60% of the population in 1990 to over 96% today. That's over 1 billion people today in China. And what's interesting to note, when we think about it, a lot of time people think, oh, China, so much of their economy is about exports. They actually make all these manufacturing goods to export them to industrialized countries. In fact, that story is changing. China's GDP today is over $11 trillion. China's exports today are about $2 trillion. There's $9 trillion in there that isn't being used to be exported. More and more of its GDP is being used for domestic consumption, to the point that it's now projected that the Chinese will spend as much on domestic retail consumption as the United States. $5.8 trillion. $5.8 trillion. That's larger than the GDP of any other country other than the United States and China. This represents a major shift in terms of how China is using its money, and it's a reflection of the fact that it has a lot more money to spend. And one question always is, as China goes, can other developing countries follow? But the fundamental point here is that we are looking at a major potential increase in consumer behavior in developing countries. We have a little better data when it comes to the middle class. In 2015, there were about 2 billion people in the middle class in developing countries who consumed, it's been estimated, about $19 trillion. We project to 2030, there's an interesting Brookings analysis on this, 4 billion people who would be consuming about $45 trillion. $45 trillion in PPP constant terms, that's more than twice the size of the entire US economy. Massive increase in aggregate consumption. Cars. Here you have a graphic in terms of projections on cars. The blue lines are the OECD, relatively stable. Everybody talks about, oh, there are going to be 2 billion cars, there are going to be a lot of electric vehicles. Well, most of that increase is going to take place in developing countries. 800 million to 1 billion new cars, additional cars in developing countries over what the OECD has. So when we think about electric vehicles, to be frank, it's relevant what we all do here, but it's much more important what China has announced, that basically they want to move to electric vehicles. There are a lot more people, a lot more electric vehicles that are going to be out there in China in 2030, 2040, 2050. Cities are a major, major driver. All the mega cities in developing countries. And in fact, when we look at projected demand, what we see is a non-urban world that is increasing, but not so much. An urban world that is increasing significantly, with much of that, 2/3 of the growth in global energy demand to 2050, coming from cities in emerging economies and developing countries. And all of these things then point to, well, what's happening on the emission side? Well, this red line shows where we have been historically and where we're projected to go under current policies and practices. And what's important is to compare this red line to where we can be as a world if we want to keep temperature increase to 2 degrees or less. That looks like the blue line. So basically, some point in 2030, if we do not have the business practices changed in developing countries, it will more than exceed where the world can be. And that's why people model a different pathway that looks like the following. That would be consistent with keeping global temperature increase to 2 degrees or less. So the big point that I wanted to make in this regard is that it's the needs of developing countries for energy to promote growth that it has now moved to the center of the climate dynamic. And that's reflected, for example, in this graph, where you have these wedges, which maybe you've seen in other cases, which are often done by technology, which shows how much we need to take away in order to get from a 6-degree world to a 2-degree world. And this is done by countries. And the big point here is that over 70% of the decarbonization in these IEA models takes place in developing countries. And similarly, that's where the bulk of investment needs to take place. As you move from the center out, that's more and more investment. Now, one point I'm going to come back to is this is the result of modeling exercise. This is not saying that this is the way that we need to go forward with this, and I'll come back to this issue a little later. So how can we grow while lowering energy emissions? Well, clearly, you all know it's renewables. Most of the renewables now are being installed in developing countries. Transport is a major issue. As I said, when we think about the emerging consumer class, it's not simply people in their bicycles or, in their personal cars or on their motorbikes. It's also people who have to get to work taking trains. Trains require a lot of energy. And so, for example, when we look at urban transport investments and we compare what we'd need if we wanted to get to 4 degrees versus 2 degrees, a lot more electrification of cars and also a lot more investment in metro and light rail. Urban heating and cooling is a very important issue. And in fact, what you see now is a breakdown of that between OECD and non-OECD countries. Expanded use of air conditioning is going to be a big demand point. There are a lot of studies that look at this. We have to figure out a way to do this effectively. As the former president of Singapore said, the key to the development of Singapore was the air conditioner, because it improved worker productivity and allowed them to do an amazing amount of things. Air conditioning, space cooling is very important. Doing it right in an energy efficient manner will be critical to our future. And then the other issue, of course, is air pollution, which is a major motivator of action. And in fact, what we see is that the energy sector is responsible for most of the key pollutants that we have. And as a result, when we look at whether it's NOx or SOx or particulate matter, what we can do to decarbonize or what we can do to affect air pollution often has a positive co-benefit on decarbonization. So mobilizing that dynamic will be very important. But I'd like to then come back to this issue of the access and the climate constraint, because in some ways I oversimplified things. If you give access to very poor people, they don't consume a lot, and that's true. But ideally, you want those poor people to become less poor. And what you have shown in this graph is that, and this is from LAC, as people become less poor, they consume more and more energy. So that at some point, we may run into some constraint, some tension in that regard. You see this, for example, if you look at China, which you've seen a significant consumption per capita increase in emissions per capita increase in China. So clearly, for the next several decades, it's clear that the basic access issue affects climate only at the margin, but the longer-term fuller prosperity that we all want for the 1.1 to 1.5 billion people who won't have access if nothing happens will at some point potentially have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, a significant impact if we're not smart about how we decarbonize. And what I've just presented before are various ways in which we can be smart about decarbonizing. Now, another related point is that even when we look at the modeling, while we've seen a significant increase in the demand out of developing countries for energy, the fact of the matter is, under 2-degree modeling, there's room for even more growth. So this is not a zero situation. There is room for growth under all IEA modeling in terms of increasing energy demand to accommodate those without access and to accommodate a variety of other growth. I've been talking a lot about developing countries, and I once did this presentation, somebody made the comment, well, what about developed countries? Let's not forget what's going on in developed countries. They actually remain key. In fact, what you have here, orange and blue, orange are the emissions out of developed countries. Okay, developing countries passed developed countries in 2010, projected to continue to increase above that. But if we just looked at what's happening in developed countries, a lot of the carbon budget is being taken up by developed countries. Fact of the matter is, this is where developed countries would need to be under IEA modeling, but I think the important point to bear in mind is that the less that developed countries emit, the more room there is for developing countries to emit. And when we think about this, oh, is that a picture of GDP per capita? We got all those developed countries there on the big above the lines. And in fact, I had my little line about how in China emissions per capita are increasing, but look at India and Africa, and if we compare that to what happens in OECD countries, they're all way above it. So fundamentally, the equities around this are very, very complicated. So some final closing thoughts. First is that energy has fueled the recent economic and social development boom that we have seen in China and we're starting to see in other parts of the world. But the climate change constraint fundamentally alters the relationship between energy and development. We need to move aggressively to decarbonization of our energy sector. And one thing to bear in mind is as developing countries grow, energy demand will also grow. And while some amount of growth in demand is consistent with the 2-degree goal, we need to delink economic growth from emissions. And in order to do that, we need to focus heavily on what this emerging consumer class in developing countries will need. What is the best way to give them the transport, the appliances, the heating, the education services, the health services that they will demand, and rightfully so, and to do that in a low-carbon manner. Access really affects climate at the margin, but as I said, as we see anticipated further growth, obviously it will become more of a constraint, and all the more reason why we all need to work together to find smart ways to go forward in a decarbonization pathway. And developed countries have a big role to play in terms of financing, technology transfer, and maybe putting a little more effort into it to reduce the emissions. Thank you very much.
Philip, thank you very much for that extremely dense and also thought-provoking, and I would say on a lot of different levels, it ought to be a troubling set of data that you have presented to us. We're now going to shift over to a panel discussion format, and we are extraordinarily fortunate to have with us, in addition to Philip, Dr. Ellen Morris and Kathleen Auth from the Power Africa program. I'd like to ask Ellen and Kathleen, as they start, to, in a way, introduce themselves to the audience that is here. These are both people who have invested themselves deeply in the set of questions around energy access, energy for development, and sustainability that have been the threads of the discussion so far. And so I'd ask that you first give a little bit of a sketch, an overview of your respective professional activities. But then I'd like to ask all three of you to respond to kind of the question that has been at the core of what you've just seen from Philip, which is an attempt to tease out the different threads of energy for those least able to afford it, energy for the developing and emerging middle class, to take up your terminology, Philip, and the climate implications and what we in industrialized countries should do against that backdrop. In a way, I'm asking you, what are the stakes that are at play for us? Ellen, why don't you kick off, please?
Sure. I don't know if, is this on?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
You have to pull it a little bit closer.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. So I really enjoyed your presentation, and it's funny because my work really focuses on developing what I think of as developing countries, but I think of I work with a different segment of developing countries, which are developing countries called least developed countries. So they're sort of in your category of description. They're not going to be really figuring in energy access as it relates to climate change at all, because these, what we call least developed countries, are 47 countries classified as such. And the reason they're classified as least developed countries is because they have characterized by very low incomes, typically on average less than $1,000 a year. They have very low GDP, and I think globally these 47 countries collectively in mainly sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, as well as Haiti, they represent 2% of the GDP, yet 13% of the global population resides in these places. So it's not that people aren't there, it's that the people that are there are really, really poor and really living in difficult situations. So energy access is something which they don't enjoy at all. Typically they have much lower access to electricity services, living in rural areas, suffering from food insecurity and the like. And so what we look at is sort of those incremental changes around, it's not a middle class, but it's certainly a private sector operation, and sort of looking at how do you work in those situations with a private sector that's characterized more by small and medium enterprises. So not looking at large renewable energy companies, big infrastructure. We're looking at how do you really start to change, even on a household by household level, access to this population, which otherwise is cooking on a three-stone fire. They are lighting their homes with kerosene, and there are really no modern options available. So we're really looking at how to move up that energy ladder. So the population that we're looking at, if you think of the energy ladder as going from the bottom, sort of very basic energy solutions, to very, at the top of the ladder, very modern energy solutions that we have in this room. And then in between are the places where Philippe is really focused on. So we're looking at, it's not solving it overnight, and it's not, sort of a same solution that Philippe would necessarily do in the countries where he is working, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should leave those people out. And so I work a lot at sort of thinking about what are the business models out there, what are the small entrepreneurs doing to sell and service and provide energy to people in urban and very far-flung rural areas, where in these places there's 5% access to electricity currently. And so there are definitely solutions which are similar to what Philippe has mentioned: distributed generation, renewable energy generation. So there's not the sense that we need to necessarily not allow or not look for solutions that include modern, clean energy, because certainly renewable energy is something in a distributed generation situation. So if you imagine it's a household with solar lighting, or it could be a mini grid connecting a community. Those kinds of very what we think of as modern renewable energy are definitely in reach of the poorest people. They need different things to make that happen. It might be access to financing. And one of the transformative things that has happened for the energy sector in the last 5 years has been things sort of leapfrogging into mobile phone payments, which in this country, they're still sort of finding their way in this country, but in developing countries, it's a very vibrant way to finance an energy product. So it could be paying incrementally over your phone for a certain number of energy units. So you'll get 2 hours of lighting, 5 hours of lighting, and it'll show you on your system how much electricity you have left, and then you can top up with your phone. And that's a very much a leapfrogging in terms of technology and in terms of financing, because the poor obviously have much less money at their disposal. So if you can pay in small increments, using the credit that's in your cell phone to turn on your solar home system, that's really transforming this space. So I think it's interesting to have Philippe's conversation, because so much of the debate and the attention is really on that middle class, those huge gains that need to be made. But I think we also need to be mindful of the people who are in that lower category, who are very low income, and giving them the same options and creating sort of ways to do both, and not necessarily do one over the other, because one is easier to do. One has obviously more investors coming in. We heard China and Brazil. Investors obviously are very much thriving there, but how do you actually create a space where investors want to invest in least developed countries in these sort of smaller markets? It's very challenging, but it can be done.
Thank you very much. Katie, if you wouldn't mind now, give please a little bit of an overview for those who are not familiar with Power Africa, although I suspect that many will be. And then if you could, some reflections on how to tease out these different threads that we've been talking about and the stakes that we have in getting it right.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad that I got to follow Ellen, because that was such an excellent kind of segue to Power Africa. I'll give a quick overview for those who are not familiar with Power Africa. It is a U.S. government initiative. It was launched in 2013. And it was essentially launched on the premise that if the U.S. government were to do anything to facilitate significant economic growth in Africa, one of the biggest things we could do would be to enable expanded access to reliable and affordable electricity. It was seen as kind of one of the primary barriers and one of the big things that the U.S. government could do. And so it was launched in 2013, and it was launched on basically 3 assumptions about what would guide our work and enable it to be successful. The first was that if we were going to do this, we had to come to it from both sides. So dovetailing really nicely with what Philip was saying, we needed to both facilitate increased supply of electricity. So many of these countries in Africa have severe supply constraints. They don't have enough power to power existing industry and demand, let alone what might grow. But at the same time, we also had to address the access question. And so we had to ensure that in addition to increasing the supply of power, we were also making sure that people were actually getting connected and being able to consume that power. So whether that's through kind of a central utility grid, or whether it's through some of the more innovative and modern distributed solutions that Ellen was talking about, coming at it from those 2 directions. The second assumption was that if we were going to do this, we were never going to be able to rely on public sector financing and traditional donor funding. There's just not enough money in those buckets to get anywhere close to what we'd like to do. And so Power Africa said, okay, then our niche, our comparative advantage has to be doing what we can to mitigate the barriers that are preventing the private sector from investing in African power sectors and enable the crowding in of that type of finance. There's certainly tremendous investment opportunities all across the African power sector, and there are many private sector companies kind of very eager to enter that space. But there are so many economic and political risks and all kinds of things that that tend to either dissuade them or to make it very difficult for them to actually enter these markets. And so what we do is try to mitigate those barriers. The third and final assumption that we based Power Africa on was that the only way to do this efficiently and effectively was to coordinate across the entire U.S. government. So there are so many tools across USAID, State Department, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, EXIM. We all have these tools at our disposal, but they're so much more effective when we can leverage them together. And so I work at USAID, which traditionally does technical assistance and capacity building. Under Power Africa, what we do is coordinate this group of 12 U.S. government agencies, and we collectively figure out, okay, we're in this country looking at this challenge. How can we combine our resources and tools to address it? So we bring in diplomatic engagement from ambassadors through the State Department. We bring in funding for feasibility studies through TDA. We bring in direct financing from OPIC. It's kind of an all-hands-on-deck coordinated approach, which we've found to be very effective. So that's Power Africa in a very large nutshell. But this other question about kind of responding to some of the tensions that Philip highlighted, I think those slides in many ways are scary and disheartening when you think about how energy demand is projected to increase and what that means for the climate. But I am going to pull out kind of maybe some optimistic points that, that we can think about. The first is that in terms of providing access to especially the poor and especially in places like Africa, I would say it's not a question of should it be a priority. It should certainly be a priority. And as Philip's data points out, that is not where the climate impact is going to come from, at least in the short term. And then in terms of kind of other climate impacts, the first positive thing is that, fortunately, there's such an economic case for renewables now in so many of these countries that African governments want renewables because they are competitively priced. They enable energy security in many cases. They diversify their generation portfolios, which makes energy supply more secure. It prevents countries in West Africa from just relying on gas supplies from Nigeria, which are inherently unstable and unpredictable and expensive. The second argument is that, or the second thing to be optimistic about is that you're seeing such rapid innovation in the off-grid sector. So many of the things that Ellen was talking about, mobile payment, all of these things are enabling off-grid renewable solutions to provide a much higher quality of service than would have been imagined a decade or so ago. And one of the really exciting things is that in addition to lighting, you're now seeing off-grid appliances that can, or off-grid systems that can power larger scale appliances. Even, things that traditionally have consumed a lot of power are becoming more and more efficient. So we recently funded a global prize for efficient off-grid refrigeration solutions. So we're trying to spur innovation in appliances that will allow people to get the energy services they need without necessarily consuming as much power as it would have taken a couple of years ago. And then the third argument is that I think there's tremendous burden on the OECD countries to focus on their own efficiency. And yeah, I think there's an argument that it should be largely on us. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Philip, do you want to come in on maybe particularly on what stakes do we have in, let's say, in the United States, because that is where we are sitting, to refine our understanding about the different challenges that face us in terms of energy development, energy access at the household level, and climate. What's in it? What are the stakes for us?
Okay. Let me respond to that, and also maybe if I could
Yeah, by all
react to
means.
some of the
That's the point.
comments.
Pull,
Okay.
pull the mic a little closer to you, though.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing that you see, I think the clear message in terms of the presentation is what happens in the United States will be increasingly driven by what's happening in the developing world. That's what you see in terms of climate, but it's not happening just in terms of climate. So if I could give you two other illustrations. As you know, the U.S. administration has a policy called energy dominance. And one of the big dimensions of energy dominance is obviously talking much more about exports. Well, where are those exports going to go? So when people are talking about building these LNG gasification plants, putting in $4 billion, where is that LNG going to go? It's probably not going to go really to Europe. It's going to go to developing countries. Why is it going to go to developing countries? Because that emerging consumer class is growing and is anticipated to get more expensive. So it's kind of ironic in some ways that, in fact, this administration's policies means that we have to think much, much more about what's happening outside, in particular in developing countries. My father's from a developing country that starts with an S and has a hole in it, I must admit, because you're talking about, well, he's Haitian. But all of those countries are going to be very, very, very significant in terms of this issue. The second thing is even in issues like how much you pay for gasoline. The fact of the matter is so much of the gasoline market, I mean, we pay prices that are determined in part by what's happening in terms of international price of oil. That will be also increasingly determined by demand outside. There are certain supply dimensions as well, but so much more of the wealth in the world is going to be outside of the United States. And so what happens outside of the United States becomes important. So if I could give you an illustration in the negative sense, there's discussion about eliminating CAFE standards or weakening them. Well, they're not being weakened in the rest of the world. So what will happen is if we have weak CAFE standards here and U.S. automakers need to respond to weak fuel efficiency standards and the rest of the world has much more stringent standards, well, you're going to find foreign car makers are going to be much better equipped to respond to that massive demand. So I think that's another illustration about the importance of thinking, really changing our perspective, thinking increasingly about what's happening outside of the United States and in particular in developed countries. Now, just if I could respond, just three quick things.
Go quick.
Yeah, real quick. First thing is I want to put my presentation in some ways in context because it relates to something you said, Ellen. The first thing is that what you tend to see when people talk about access, and I worked a lot on climate change, is they'll say, access, we're going to give access to 1.1 billion people, and there's a climate change problem out there. And so we have to do it through renewables or something else. There's not a climate change problem really related to access. And so part of the point is to sort of say, you want to talk about climate change? There's a big climate change issue. Let's focus on what we're consuming. Let's focus on what richer populations are consuming. Let's not burden the access issue with that. Fortunately, as you both noted, there have been significant improvements in terms of the cost of renewables, and that helps facilitate things. But if I can make one last comment, which is what I heard from both of you in some ways, so I'll be a little more provocative, is a lot of donor oriented discussions. You mentioned clean. So clean for me sounds like renewables. Well, giving access maybe doesn't have to be clean. You mentioned the private sector. Well, look, the fact of the matter is when you look at access, successful access programs around the world, China, North Africa, Brazil, they've actually been dominated by state-owned enterprises. And in fact, I actually spent 14 years working on least developed countries, including in Ethiopia. And when I was dealing with the Ethiopians, they said, you know, we've got a utility, we've got all this hydropower, we want to extend the grid. They tried a World Bank project where they tried to do off-grid solutions. It didn't work very well. So a lot of time what tends to happen on the access discussion, because we're talking about poorer people, is that certain donor preferences tend to take on potentially too much weight rather than sort of developing what are better oriented solutions.
Well, so I'd like to seize on that and ask Ellen and Katie to come back in, because it seems to me that an important question is what is the right role for the private sector? Different finance structures may be needed. You've talked, Ellen, about engaging with very local entrepreneurs. Could you please comment a little bit in response to Philippe's point? You know, where is the role of the private sector, and for that matter, whose private sector is it? Is it indigenous or is it foreign?
Sure. I just wanted to first respond to something that Philippe said, which was state-owned enterprises and public utilities supplying, in Ethiopia. And, that is the reality, obviously, these large centralized utilities. That's the old model, and it's a very traditional model that isn't reaching the people in the very far-flung rural areas, or even not too far from the urban capitals. And the point is that that is the model, and it has been that way for many years. However, governments are now starting to realize that is that grid really going to reach someone in 20 years, 30 years? And what do those people do in the meantime? It's never going to reach them. And in some cases, the grid is there, but it's going overhead because the community cannot afford the $300 connection fee into the grid. So there may be so-called grid connection there that's getting credit for grid connection, but the people are not actually getting electricity. So that's one point I have about sort of public utilities, and Ethiopia is a very good example of a lot of unserved people in the rural areas that will not see electricity, using that model for a really long time. So that's one thing. And in terms of the investment in the private sector, typically in a lot of these countries, they're lend itself to sort of smaller projects and smaller sort of irregular and sort of projects that are difficult to necessarily get your arms around. They're also less developed financial markets. So the places that are not the big, robust economies out there, they tend to have not very well-developed financial markets. There's also limited capacity in those countries. And how do you set up banking regulations? How do you set up power purchase agreements? All sorts of things which you sort of take for granted in this country and the larger economies. And sort of thinking about how all those pieces come into play is hugely important for attracting the private sector. And that private sector now comes through places and through vehicles like Power Africa, because Power Africa isn't the only one out there, but there's a lot of development finance institutions all over the world who are trying to basically smooth that transition for the private sector to be able to come to the table. Because right now, left to their own devices, that private sector will be more likely to go to the places where it's easy and the returns are higher and the projects are more well defined, et cetera. So I think that's one point. And the second point is in terms of, is that private sector coming from the inside or coming from the outside? And when you see, especially in local small and medium enterprises run by local entrepreneurs, there's a mixed bag. Some of these really interesting social enterprises that are pushing innovation around energy access and different kinds of business models are basically coming from other places like the US or coming from Europe, and very clever young people coming in and doing amazing jobs in Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya. However, what we see now also happening is there are local entrepreneurs from within their own countries in sub-Saharan Africa also pushing innovation or working in partnership with some of these international companies. So that private sector with the small and medium enterprises, it is kind of a mixed bag, and I'm really happy that it's now emerging to be not just outsiders coming in with the models, but these models are now being also incubated locally as well.
So, Katie, you want to come in on this question of role of private sector?
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to respond to Philip too. Sorry to tag team and jump on you, but so Philip had suggested that donors kind of may push for I forget how you phrased it.
Preferences, I don't know.
Their agenda.
Yeah. And he had mentioned the central utility question. And I think in Africa, I would almost flip that on its head in many cases. I think in many cases, the kind of international access agenda drives central utilities in Africa and governments to push for rapid electrification. And there's a lot of financing to try to connect people to the grid, as Ellen was saying. But these are companies, for the vast majority of the cases, that are bankrupt. And that for every customer that they connect, because of the way that the tariffs are set and because of the way that the subsidies are in play and many other things, for every customer that a utility connects, they actually lose money. And so if donors are pushing for kind of rapid connection of new customers, you're actually driving the utilities further into the ground. And that's certainly not what we want to do. So when we approach it, we try to come at it in a cohesive way. We're strengthening utilities. We're trying to make them solvent, as are many development partners. We're also taking seriously this private sector off-grid model, which are having, they're having great success, particularly in places like East Africa. And how those two solutions fit together to try to provide power to the most people in the most sustainable way. On the private sector question, I would just say we touch on everyone from GE to small startups in Africa. I think it has to be everyone. I think they all need something different. So small startups, often we're providing grant capital that enables them to start up their business, or we're providing financing that enables an off-grid company to move from East Africa into West African markets, and providing them with market intelligence to help do that. But GE and big companies like that, mostly they want us to be working with the African governments to fix the regulatory policies and do the policy work that enables them to be able to go in with less risk.
Can I
Yes,
respond just quickly?
real quick.
So first of all, I agree, there's been some wonderful stuff in terms of off-grid solutions using the private sector and business models. But I think we tend to forget the history of what has happened. Most successful large-scale electrification projects have been carried out by state utilities. They are inefficient, I agreed. But if I could use your example of bankrupt. In fact, like in Ethiopia and other countries, you may end up with a company that looks like it's bankrupt on paper, but they don't tend to shut in because the government continues to provide them financing. So I think something, not always the case, but as a general proposition. So I think something we just have to be a little careful about is that we tend to love the private sector in this country, and it works very well with our culture. But there are many countries, like even in France, where they are not as sympathetic to the private sector. And I think sometimes we tend to underestimate how we can do a better job at increasing access by relying on fundamentally inefficient state-owned enterprises. Again, that's the way they did it in China, that's the way they did it in Brazil, that's the way they did it in North Africa.
Okay, two comments. First of all, I mean, I should have said at the outset, but it is inherent in a kind of macro conversation, which is the nature of this one, that you end up being horribly at risk of fuzzing together, literally hundreds of different settings that are distinct by climatological, by natural resource endowment, by other features. And so I acknowledge that that's a design fault in tonight's program, but here we are. Second, before I go back to asking questions, I want to remind you all that we will be shortly shifting to your questions from the audience, and either for those in person or for those watching online or listening, you can use the hashtag CGEP events and the Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy to ask a question. So let me just ask as one final question from me and then shift. Is there in fact enough finance out there today to meet the requirements, A, for the access agenda, those least able to pay, obviously not overnight, and B, for the kind of development, energy for development agenda? Is there enough money out there in different forms?
Why'd you go, Grace?
I don't know that I have a yes or no answer. I think yes, we have to do everything we can to try to ensure that the answer to that is yes. And I think what makes me optimistic about that is because there's a combination now of really strong commitment on the part of public sector, kind of traditional financiers and donors, all looking at the energy sector. There's so much attention and prioritization being given to this issue that there's more money coming in from that sector than there has been in the past. At the same time, you do have immense private sector interest, and that interest is growing even in places that are among the most traditionally riskiest markets in the world. And so I'm optimistic. I don't know that I have a yes or no answer.
Ellen, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think, when you think about the investment, there is a huge amount of attention being paid to least developed countries, developing countries, just because economically it makes sense. It's not anything even about climate. It's the least cost solution now, renewables. And so I think that's an important point. And I think in terms of the capital, you said it in your remarks, is that, relying on the traditional model of the public sector and the government and all of that, it's just, or in development aid from the multilaterals, it's just not going to happen. And I think, there needs to be, and there is attention being made to how to really combine that development assistance, which can take the form of, concessional loans and loan guarantees or grants to sort of get projects going, that combined with more commercial capital, even if it's commercial capital at a lower rate of return, is hugely important, and that's the direction that it's going, which is really, I think, a positive move.
Great. And Philippe, please come in, but I'll just invite those who have questions to approach the microphone, because we'll come to you next. So we need that brave first person who will ask the first question. Philippe, please, if you will.
Yeah, so the answer to your first question is yes, there is enough money. It's just in the wrong spots. All right? So, I mean, that goes to the least developed country issue. So where you need the money's not there, and the economies are not large enough, really, to generate the type of economic development so that they can self-fund. Having said that, there are certain countries where you've seen, successful countries where you've seen they've been able to get in place the appropriate economic policies to be able to grow their economies, to finance their own expansion programs. And there they tend to rely on technical assistance and know-how from developing countries and donors to do it better. So there is enough money globally, it's just not in the right countries.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'd like to open the floor for comments, and I'm still not seeing that brave first person. I exhort and encourage you. In the meanwhile, let me ask a question that that comes from Twitter, and that is essentially a question around technology, and technology and innovation and cost. So as we hope to see more of the kind of progressive increase in requirement for energy services, as those least able to pay today become those a bit better able to pay tomorrow, and then grow in their requirements. But that changeover does kind of increasingly speak to the growth in emissions in that emergent middle class. Are the tools out there today that are available and affordable for that emergent middle class to have a low carbon solution? The questioner posed the question by referring to the need for a magical solution on carbon capture, and who would pay for that? So can you talk a little bit about how technology and innovation and costs of low carbon solutions fits into this picture, please?
Okay. So quickly, to respond relatively quickly, it's interesting if you look at the International Energy Agency modeling, which shows that there's a pathway to getting to 2 degrees consistent with a global GDP in 2050 that is 3 times the size of what the current global economy is. Now, that assumes a certain amount of reasonable improvements in technology, but it doesn't incorporate into it any disruptive technology. So the fact of the matter is, assuming a relatively conservative improvement in technologies, we can get there. What's needed is policy commitment and the like, and that's what tends to be lacking. Now, having said that, the fact of the matter is, if we can get better innovation, we can be more effective, not only simply in terms of reducing costs, but if I could give you an illustration, the Elon Musk, everybody talks about the cars and the like. Something I find very interesting is his boring machine, where he's going to figure out a way to build tunnels relatively quickly. One of the best ways to move ahead with urban transport systems is to use metros and other light rail systems. So there are a variety of potential technological innovations out there that can be very beneficial, not only from a cost perspective, but also from a delivery of low carbon alternatives.
Thank you. Katie, do you want to come in on this? Or okay, all right. Sir, if you wouldn't mind, just please introduce yourself and state your question, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Hi, my name is Eugene. I'm a student at SUMA, and I'm also a portfolio manager at a large asset manager.
And for those not from the Columbia community, that means sustainability management.
Oh, sorry. Yep, thank you. So I have 2 questions for you. The first one is it's, I guess, for all of you, but Philip, you put the slides up. I saw the source of a lot of the slides were big organizations like IEA. And we're talking about how a lot of the growth will be from the emerging market countries. And in our sustainability management program, we're spending a lot of time looking at US data, and it's been eye-opening to me in terms of thinking about the source of that data. I'm questioning how accurate that is. And so then I started thinking about these big growth assumptions that have been made for the emerging markets. How comfortable are we really around the data that's being used to forecast some of those assumptions? So that's question number one. And if it's okay, I'll just toss the second question out there. It's a simpler one. And I think it would be for you. On thinking about Power for Africa, we talked about things like grid and renewable. How much of a factor do building materials come into the solution in terms of, we're talking about things like heating and cooling. So if we're providing them with better materials, just even education on if you use this, you're going to get better energy efficiency.
Thank you for those questions. So number one is data reliability, underlying the projections going forward. And the second for Katie, I think, was higher efficiency building materials. Who wants to start off? Please.
I'll start on the data one because the data, we did a study this summer on investment flows into sustainable energy, in least developed countries. So we tried to really track down where investment was coming from, where it was being deployed, how it was being deployed, how much was being deployed. And the data is just really hard to come by. There's Bloomberg has a program called the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and they do something called Climate Scope, where they're really carefully tracking by going on the ground and really verifying and validating data on investment flows in a lot of countries. And in their massive data set, which is, in my mind, very reliable and robust, there were only 15 least developed countries. So in our data set of 47 countries, we only had somewhat reliable data in 15. And so one of the things I think which is also holding back investment in that market is lack of reliable data, because you get this massive high altitude data, which is difficult to even verify at the ground level. When you're talking, even electrification rates, that's such a ridiculously ambiguous number to try to figure out, because what do you call someone who's electrified if, as I said, the line is going overhead? That's counted as electrified, but people do not have access to electricity. So I think, your point around data is a huge, important point. And as a student, I think it's a really good thing to ask those kind of questions, and we do that all the time with our students, is try to say, look, you need to ask the questions about the data. What is the source? Because there is so much ambiguity in a lot of the data and in these markets. The second point around data that I just wanted to mention, because I'm working a lot on it, is this issue of gender disaggregated data. So not only looking at the sort of very technical energy aspects in aggregate, but to look at how are women and men accessing energy differently, using energy, purchasing energy, requirements different. And so that gender disaggregated data around energy access is really absent as well. So it's a growth field if you are thinking about that kind of a job after you graduate, but it's something which is hard to get your arms around.
Well, if I could just push you a little bit on that. I mean, one of the traditional models, if you look at the Energy Information Administration, or IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is funded by member governments, all of which happen to be OECD member governments, therefore better off. The model traditionally when it comes to energy data has been that this is a public good that is provided by government. So are there alternative models for how one comes at that? Are there different ways of thinking about more reliable energy data that don't presume budgeting on the part of central governments to enable that? You want to come in on that, Philip? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Did you want to
go
come in?
I was just going to say, I was just going to say, that, I think the realization is that that's not all coming from public budgets, which are much easier to sort of figure out, even though that data is also fraught with irregularities as well. So I think you're right. There is this sense that that data can be obtained if there is more sort of a public utility model, but that is changing, I think, as well. And in least developed countries, but I want to say even in the IEA data set, there's still so much irregularity. And you look at even the Human Development Index of the United Nations, it's difficult to verify and to sort of understand those nuances in the data. But I think what I find interesting is, people like Bloomberg are now recognizing these developing countries, least developed countries, as really important markets to be going after. And they're recognizing that in order for that trajectory to happen, they need data for those investors to come in.
So just to complement the thought, I think there have been a variety of technological improvements that have facilitated data generation, right? One of the big things that the World Bank used to rely on, still relies on, are household surveys. Mm-hmm. And you had to have people go out there and now you've got these phones out there, and it makes it a lot easier. There is an inadequate level of data out there. We need to do better. But having said that, I think a lot of the projections that we see are good enough for the current purposes. Sure. I would sort of respond in a slightly different way, which is that I think there's a bias in the data, a bias in terms of what we choose to collect, and then that drives our analysis. I once heard somebody say something, it's a phrase I like a lot, we tend to treasure what we measure. Mm-hmm. We need to measure what we treasure. And so that means we need to think a little more, what is it that we actually really care about? And we need to start doing a better job about generating the data to enable us to do that. Because we live in a culture now that's becoming, I'd almost say, data monitoring, evaluation obsessed. And we're being driven too much by the limitations of our data, and that's driving us to sort of focus in on certain items in terms of flipping it around, thinking about what it is we care about, and figuring out ways to get the data to support that analysis.
Katie, to you on data reliability, if you wish, and efficient building materials, please.
Yeah, I mean, quickly on data reliability, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, data is very limited. And we actually co-funded Bloomberg's expansion into Africa for Climate Scope, and because we saw it as critical that these countries be covered in that way. But there's a lot more work to do, as Philip indicated. On the energy efficiency piece, I mean, I would say, hands down, yes. Energy efficient measures and things to do with building materials and the way that homes and offices are constructed is crucial. It's not something that Power Africa specifically focuses on or devotes explicit programming to, but often you'll see that, the most cost-efficient, fastest, cheapest, simplest solutions are those that help to reduce demand and therefore open up avenues for you to use energy in better and more efficient ways. So it's certainly a major piece of the puzzle.
Thank you very much. Please, over to you.
So I have a question about, as other countries enter the development space, I'm curious if there's contention between your priorities. For example, we have China, who's putting a lot of investment in infrastructure in Africa. So is that in contention with a lot of the work you're doing, or is there collaboration across different countries' development priorities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm sure everyone is aware of how involved in the energy sector in Africa China is. I think what you're seeing now is kind of probably a little bit of a delayed recognition on the part of traditional development partners that their influence is as large and as broad as it is. And so there's a little bit of scrambling to kind of catch up to that and react. But I think a lot of what you're seeing is an effort on the part of more traditional development partners to make sure that we're emphasizing kind of an open and transparent, market-oriented approach that kind of continues to prioritize high environmental and social standards. And the more that we can collaborate with China and operate in that space, the better. But certainly there is, if not tension, then just a little bit of an adjustment period as we all kind of collectively establish what those interrelationships look like now, particularly in Africa as the context changes so rapidly.
So just a brief heads up before I come to you, Ellen. I'm going to ask our panelists as we approach the witching hour to be thinking about maybe as a lightning round at the end, if you could put your finger on one or two of the most exciting positive things that you see, creative combinations of technology and finance in whatever combination of forms, and good projects in the in this space around energy access, energy for development. That'll be our last gasp, but please, Ellen, do come in now with your comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the China piece, because as you say, everywhere you go in Africa, every road, every water system, every bridge, everything is being invested by the Chinese. And when we were looking at investments in these least developed countries, to your point about transparency, it was very difficult to impossible to figure out what was the flow of Chinese dollars investing in infrastructure, energy infrastructure in Africa and elsewhere. So
is that a good thing or a bad thing, and why?
Well, I mean, I just think I think it's probably a bad thing, because I think these countries need to start to create a much more transparent structure, and I don't think they necessarily even know, the countries themselves, how much money is coming in from, for instance, China. And I think the point of Power Africa and other donors and other development partners is that helping countries advocate for themselves and create the systems to require environmental and social safeguards for not just the Chinese, but anyone coming in and working in their country, so that, waste disposal, human rights, trafficking, all sorts of things, that you sort of empower those countries with the skills that can come from these donors, other development partners who are working hand in hand to do the right thing in these countries. So I think it's helping those governments and those systems be put in place so that they can be have very responsible development in their country, wherever the money's coming from.
Great. I'm going to come to my lightning round in a second, and I'm going to start with you, Philip, and come down in this direction. But just giving my colleagues on the panel another minute or two to talk, let me mention as a public service announcement that this event tonight is one of a number of different events that the Center on Global Energy Policy is hosting in the coming weeks. Upcoming events include on the 13th of February, John Conti, who's the Deputy Administrator of the Energy Information Administration. So you may have an opportunity to reprise your question about data reliability. He'll be talking about the annual energy outlook. You can continue reprising your question on the 28th of February, when Spencer Dale, the Chief Economist of BP, will be presenting their 2018 energy outlook. In a very different frame, March 1st, we will have a panel discussion on energy, economics, and geopolitics in the Gulf Arab states. And then on March 19th, another Where Next on Climate event focusing on responses from America's corporate boardrooms to climate policy. So, Philip, let's go back to the lightning round. What, if you could point to a case that's encouraging, where you're seeing smart combinations of people and finance and technology, what would you point to?
Okay, let me answer that in a slightly different way.
Fair enough.
In terms of something that's encouraging, I think basically the international consensus we've seen around a couple of critical issues is very encouraging. So the whole access issue, we have sustainable energy for all. We had the UN coming out and saying we need to get universal access. I started working on access about 25 years ago. It's much more diffuse and the like. As the international community came together and said, look, this is a priority for all of us. I think that helped to mobilize a lot more attention, and then that helps to also generate much more innovation. As you, Ellen, pointed out, there are a lot of very innovative off-grid solutions that are taking place. I think in some ways they're the direct result of the change in culture. Culture, I think, is very, very important. The international consensus on climate change is also an indication, and it's also an illustration of a change in culture. We talk a lot more, we care a lot more about this issue, we do a lot more about it than we did 15, 20 years ago. So I think those are two illustrations of changes that I think are very important, and that in some ways deal with the issue of culture. And I don't know if it's innovation or it's not technology, but I think sometimes they're what helps spur the technological innovations.
Different approaches to questions, absolutely in bounds. Katie, it's over to you.
So I'll highlight something that we just recently launched, which I think is really exciting and cool, which is called the Smart Communities Coalition. And it's a partnership among USAID, the State Department, and then a whole host of really diverse partners, MasterCard, Accenture, Chatham House, the Danish Refugee Council, so a really kind of diverse mix of players, and partnering on an effort to kind of capitalize on a lot of these off-grid innovations that you're seeing now, as well as on the proliferation of mobile phones, to provide enhanced services for refugee encampments. So across much of the world now you're seeing huge refugee settlements that unfortunately are almost semi-permanent structures. And often people living in those communities have very limited opportunities to communicate, to hear news throughout the camp, to share information, to purchase things, to do a whole host of everyday actions that they need to take. And so we're piloting the use of microgrid technologies in refugee camps that will power those services through a combination of energy solutions, but also digital finance, and then also provide power to the local populations that may live outside the camps but nearby. And so I think it's, and the most exciting part is that then those pilots, we're gonna test business models and things, technologies within the microgrid solutions that then hopefully can be replicated in other scenarios and in refugee camps across the board. So it's an exciting approach that draws together kind of humanitarianism, entrepreneurialism, and development assistance.
Great. Thanks so much, Ellen. Over to you.
Sure. To me, I guess what I see happening, I mean, I was in a long time ago too, and energy access was always sort of this fuzzy thing that was hard to see where the opportunity was, and it was so donor driven. But where I've seen that fuzziness also change is a recognition, and it's funny because I come from sort of the engineering technical side, but the last 3 or 4 or 5 years I got very involved in looking at the inclusion of women and marginalized people as part of the solution for energy access. So gender equality is now so on the radar of every donor, every investor, local governments, national governments, regional entities, and it's just something I would have never predicted or imagined, but it's very great to see that now thinking about land tenure, can women own land, to make a decision about how energy, placement of power lines, livelihoods, are women able to benefit from access to energy? Women and girls entering technical fields, women in the workforce. It covers everything, but the energy sector typically has, and a lot of extractive industries are very male-dominated, but now the recognition is, okay, we need to have a more balanced workforce. How do we get there? And to me, that's a very exciting place to be, and people are recognizing, why should we leave half of our population behind, either in our workforce or in benefiting from access to energy. So that's where I think the most, for me, a high point is. The second thing I just wanted to mention was in the case of regional integration and countries working together, there is the Economic Community of West African States, which is 15 countries. There's also the East African Community, and there's also the Southern African Community. And each of those now has centers for renewable energy and energy efficiency. which is really driving the adoption in a regional way and in a very interconnected way in each of those places for accelerating the clean energy transition in those places in Africa. So I think that is also another super exciting development.
Thank you very much for those three reflections. We have reached the end. As a matter of fact, we've gone a little bit over time, which we generally try not to do. As I mentioned earlier, I think, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website of the Center on Global Energy Policy in a few days. You can also subscribe to our podcast series, which is called Columbia Energy Exchange, on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms. I hope that you will all join me in thanking our excellent panelists for their contributions tonight.